The war that began in shadows now burns in public. Between 2021 and 2024, Iran enriched uranium to near weapons-grade levels. Israel retaliated with sabotage, airstrikes, and assassinations. And what was once a deniable standoff became a visible confrontation, calibrated but combustible. The question is no longer if this ends in conflict. The question is, can both sides pull back from the brink?
We're plunging into a conflict that's been simmering for decades, often called a shadow war. But between 2020 and 2025, something, well, fundamentally shifted. Based on the stack of reports, analyses, and accounts you've shared with us, the rivalry between Israel and Iran dramatically stepped out of the shadows.
It really did. And these sources you've provided, they give us a lot to work with, don't they?
What do these sources give us to work with? It's a rich mix. Analyses from think tanks, reports from international bodies like the IAEA and the UN, official government statements, and detailed accounts from reputable news organizations. Together, they shine a light on this specific time frame, covering critical events, the frustrating twists and turns of nuclear diplomacy, the pressure tactics employed, the blowback from proxy conflicts, and the big, undeniable strategic shifts that reshaped the regional landscape.
We want to trace the chain of events, understand the strategic logic or sometimes, the miscalculation behind the actions of both sides, and grasp the significant consequences now that this conflict has become so much more overt.
Yeah, and to emphasize, this isn't about taking sides or endorsing viewpoints.
Not at all. It's about helping you understand what happened during this pivotal period, strictly based on the material provided, purely information.
Exactly. Think of us as your guides through this complex information. We're going to pull out the most surprising details, the high-stakes maneuvers, the really fascinating technological twists, and crucially explore just how close the region came and arguably remains to a much wider conflict.
There's a lot.
Get ready, because we're about to unpack some critical knowledge together from your sources. So where does this turning point begin? Our sources point to 2020 and 2021 as having the final sparks that really ignited this more visible phase of the rivalry. For years, so much of the tension between Israel and Iran was conducted in the shadows, below the surface.
Kept quiet, mostly.
Right. But then came a couple of events that ripped away some of that deniability and brought things into the glaring light.
That's right. And the first major event that dramatically illustrates this shift, based on the source material, is the assassination of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh in November 2020.
Fakhrizadeh. Remind us who he was.
He was a physicist, long identified by Israeli and Western intelligence agencies as a central figure, often described as the architect of Iran's alleged nuclear weapons program. So his elimination was significant, and it was executed in a way that seemed, deliberately audacious.
And the sources provide some incredibly specific details about the method used, which tells us a lot about the state of this shadow war. This wasn't a typical close quarters hit.
No, not at all.
It happened on November 27, 2020. Maybe we can remember that as near Thanksgiving 2020, Fakhrizadeh gone in Absard, a town about 70 kilometers east of Tehran. And it was a brazen attack carried out in broad daylight.
The technique was almost futuristic, reading through the descriptions. According to the sources, the operation involved a remote-controlled machine gun.
Not just a simple remote trigger.
Far from it. This wasn't just bolted onto something. It was part of an advanced robotic apparatus mounted on a parked pickup truck. This rig included a video camera for targeting and, notably, an AI-driven system.
An AI-driven assassination weapon. That sounds like something out of science fiction.
It does, but the sources describe it as real-world application. They detail how this complex device, reportedly weighing about a ton, had to be smuggled into Iran in pieces over time and then reassembled for the operation.
Smuggled in piece by piece.
Wow. And then controlled remotely, reportedly via satellite, by operatives believed to be from Israel's Mossad, operating from outside Iran. They had a real-time visual feed, and the AI system was apparently used to compensate for factors like gun recoil and signal delay, ensuring accuracy over a distance without a human operator physically present.
So they basically created a stationary, remote-controlled kill zone activated from miles away. The sources say Fakhrizadeh's convoy was passing through the area and was apparently slowed down over a speed bump.
Exactly. That's when the automated gun opened fire on his sedan.
A speed bump as the trigger point?
Precisely. An initial burst injured Fakhrizadeh, causing his vehicle to stop. The sources note that when he then stepped out of the car, the machine gun fired 3 additional fatal shots. The whole sequence, about 13 to 15 shots, happened in under a minute.
Under a minute.
And the key point here, the detail that made this operation so technologically advanced and publicly discussed, was that there were no on-site assassins physically present to pull the trigger.
No one needed to be on the ground in that moment. What happened immediately after?
Immediately after the shots, the pickup truck carrying the weapon exploded, likely to destroy evidence. Although, as the sources note, parts of the rig did survive and were recovered, offering clues about the sophisticated technology involved.
So, not perfectly destroyed?
Apparently not.
No.
This method, using a satellite-linked AI-assisted smart weapon with facial recognition for targeting, represented a new frontier in targeted killings, moving away from traditional on-the-ground operatives in the final moment.
Fakhrizadeh himself was 59, traveling with his wife, who survived, and escorts, but reportedly wasn't in an armored car himself. This happened at a very sensitive geopolitical moment, right?
Extremely sensitive. Just weeks after the U.S. presidential election, with Iran assessing its strategy for a new administration.
And he wasn't the first Iranian scientist targeted.
No, he was the most prominent Iranian nuclear scientist killed since 2010, the fifth overall. His killing came less than a year after the U.S. strike that killed Iran's top general, Qasem Soleimani, in early 2020. Both events, though different in nature, contributed to this growing sense that the invisible war against Iran's strategic capabilities was being pushed into the public eye.
A quick review question for you listening. What was particularly novel or advanced about the method used to assassinate Fakhrizadeh, according to these sources?
Good question. It was that remote-controlled, AI-assisted machine gun operated via satellite, with no assassins present on site.
Let's talk about the attribution and the reaction. Iran immediately blamed Israel. Given Fakhrizadeh's history, that makes sense. Prime Minister Netanyahu had publicly singled him out years before.
It was a swift accusation. Israel, following its usual policy, didn't confirm or deny involvement. However, the sources note they reportedly heightened security at Israeli embassies globally, anticipating Iranian retaliation.
Preparing for blowback.
Within days, Western intelligence sources and media reports were widely identifying Israel's Mossad as the likely perpetrator.
And the later confirmation, did that come through?
Yes, a detailed investigation reported in September 2021, cited in the sources, corroborated that Mossad carried out the assassination using this unique remote gun method. Preparations had reportedly spanned years, with tracking dating back to 2007 and accelerated in 2020.
So a long-term operation.
Very much so. Sources mention consultations with the outgoing Trump administration, known for its hardline stance on Iran.
So the U.S. was aware of the potential strike.
According to reports, U.S. officials were informed. Israel reportedly thought U.S. assent and protection beforehand, recognizing the risk of triggering a wider conflict. The sources note that the U.S. did not publicly object, and President Trump even retweeted news of Fakhrizadeh's death, which was widely interpreted as tacit approval.
Retweeting the news, that's a signal in itself.
It was seen that way. While Israel maintained official silence, intelligence leaks and media reporting, often highlighting the sophistication of the robotic weapon, left little doubt about the widely perceived attribution.
How did Iranian officials react? There must have been intense internal pressure for a strong response.
There was certainly public fury, but Iran's leadership also engaged in careful strategic calculation. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei called for definitive punishment of those responsible. But importantly, he emphasized that Fakhrizadeh's scientific work must be continued and accelerated as the true response. This became a central theme.
Interesting. Continue the work as the main response.
Exactly. President Hassan Rouhani blamed the mercenary usurping Zionist regime and vowed that Iran's development would not stop. He promised revenge in a proper time, signaling a calculated, non-immediate military response.
In a proper time allows for strategic flexibility.
Precisely. Leaders of the IRGC and armed forces issued strong vows of severe revenge. Foreign Minister Javad Zarif called it state terrorism, with serious indications of an Israeli role, and wrote to the UN asserting Iran's right to self-defense.
But did everyone agree on waiting?
Not entirely. Hardline factions pushed for immediate, tougher retribution. Some lawmakers chanted calls for revenge. The Kahan newspaper called for an eye for an eye, but the leadership ultimately opted for patience on the military front. Some outside voices, like former CIA Director John Brennan, even suggested it might be a provocation attempt in Trump's final weeks, urging Iran not to lash out. So the leadership trod a fine line, vowed revenge in due time, but avoided a hasty military response.
It sounds like a deliberate decision not to respond militarily right away. But what was the impact on Iran's nuclear policy and strategy? This is where the sources show a clear, immediate link, a kind of strategic revenge.
This is where it gets really interesting. The assassination, far from crippling Iran's nuclear program, actually hardened Iran's resolve and triggered significant, almost immediate policy changes.
How so?
Within days, Iran's parliament, dominated by hardliners, framed the expansion of Iran's nuclear work as the best response, making Fakhrizadeh a martyr whose legacy would be a stronger program.
So instead of bombs, the immediate retaliation was through centrifuges and legislation.
Precisely. In early December 2020, just after the assassination, lawmakers accelerated and passed a bill titled the Strategic Action to Lift Sanctions. This law mandated that the government enrich uranium to 20% purity, a significant jump from the 3.67% limit of the 2015 nuclear deal, deploy more advanced centrifuges, and reduce cooperation with UN inspectors.
So here's another review question based on that. What was Iran's immediate policy response to Fakhrizadeh's killing, according to the sources?
The immediate policy response was passing that strategic action law, mandating steps like 20% enrichment and reduced IAEA cooperation.
This legislation was a clear, direct policy reaction to the assassination. It also required Iran to suspend voluntary implementation of the IAEA's additional protocol, which allows for snap inspections if sanctions weren't lifted, effectively escalating the nuclear standoff.
And they acted on it quickly. By January 2021, Iran followed through on the law, resuming 20% enrichment at the Fordo facility.
And politically, how was this framed?
Supreme Leader Khamenei and others used Fakhrizadeh's killing to bolster the narrative that engaging with the West is dangerous and futile, reinforcing an anti-compromise stance among hardliners. This directly contributed to a tougher Iranian negotiating posture, complicating efforts by the new U.S. administration under Biden to revive diplomacy.
So it undermined the potential for talks.
One analysis in the sources notes that while such assassinations might not permanently set back technical progress, they succeed in undermining diplomacy, making any return to the nuclear deal more difficult. The prospect of JCPOA revival became entangled with Iranian demands to avenge Fakhrizadeh's death by accelerating nuclear activity, creating a more perilous environment for talks.
So the strategic revenge was nuclear acceleration.
Exactly. Iran chose patience for direct military retaliation, opting instead for this strategic revenge by increasing its nuclear leverage. Over the next period, this contributed to Iran accumulate a more enriched uranium and advanced centrifuges, raising tensions with Israel and alarming world powers. The covert elimination of Fakhrizadeh, therefore, exposed the edges of the shadow war and pushed Iran's nuclear issue into a more openly confrontational phase, complicating international relations significantly.
Wow. That first event really set a new dynamic. Let's quickly recap the Fakhrizadeh assassination and its immediate aftermath for retention.
To recap the first key event, the assassination of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh in November 2020 outside Tehran, widely attributed to Israel, was notable for the highly sophisticated remote-controlled machine gun using AI that was employed.
And the outcome wasn't immediate military revenge, but a strategic pivot. Iran's parliament passed a law mandating acceleration of nuclear work, including 20% enrichment as strategic revenge, which Iran began implementing in early 2021.
Let's move to the second major event in this period that further brought the conflict into the open. The Natanz nuclear facility sabotage in April 2021. This happened right in the middle of sensitive international negotiations to revive the JCPOA nuclear deal.
Talk about disruptive timing in the middle of talks.
Exactly. On April 11, 2021, a major incident occurred at Iran's main uranium enrichment site at Natanz, an underground facility in Isfahan province. Initially, Iranian officials described it as a problem with the electrical distribution network, an accident.
An accident that rarely holds up.
No, and it quickly became evident that this was far more serious and deliberate. It was clear an explosion had taken place, causing a widespread power outage across the underground halls housing Natanz centrifuges. Iran's Atomic Energy Organization chief, Ali Akbar Salehi, wasted no time, condemning the event as nuclear terrorism the same day. He explicitly linked it to enemies of Iran trying to derail the ongoing nuclear talks in Vienna.
And the timing, just hours after Iran showcased new advanced centrifuges for its Nuclear Technology Day.
Which was widely interpreted as deliberate, designed to maximize both technical damage and symbolic embarrassment for Iran. Like Fakhrizadeh, this was an operation covert in its execution, but with very overt, publicly known consequences. It knocked out power and damaged or destroyed a significant number of centrifuges in the underground plant.
What details do the sources provide about the sabotage technique itself? Was it explosives? Cyber?
Details that emerged pointed to a clandestine operation involving explosives. According to the AEOI spokesman, a blast targeted the plant's electrical distribution system, causing a ceiling collapse in a control room and cutting off power vital for running the centrifuges.
So explosives hitting the power system.
Yeah, it seems the consensus. Iranian authorities indicated they identified a suspect who caused the power outage and were pursuing arrest, suggesting an insider or a device planted within the facility.
So potentially an inside job facilitating the sabotage.
That's one possibility mentioned. Later Iranian reports, though not officially confirmed, alleged a staff member had smuggled a small explosive device into the facility and fled before it was detonated. Israeli media accounts, citing intelligence sources, offered a slightly different version, claiming Mossad carried out a cyber attack that triggered the power failure.
Cyber or physical, or both.
It's possible a cyber component was used to coordinate, mask, or amplify a physical blast, or that one story was cover for the other. The sources lean towards an explosive device, causing the primary damage to the power system. Regardless of the precise method, the result was the same. Natanz's primary power supply was crippled.
And the centrifuges.
Thousands of centrifuges, primarily older IR-1 models, abruptly lost power, crashed, and were rendered inoperable. Iran confirmed that cascades of these first-generation machines were taken offline.
How extensive was the damage? Iran seemed to minimize it publicly.
While Iran's nuclear head downplayed it, saying emergency power kicked in, independent assessments and leaks cited in the sources painted a more serious picture. Multiple Western and Israeli sources described extensive damage, potentially setting back Iran's enrichment capability at Natanz by months.
Months of setback.
The Institute for Science and International Security, ISIS, estimated several thousand centrifuges might have been destroyed. Iran's own admission that it needed to replace the ruined IR-1s, and its plan to replace them with more efficient, advanced models, confirms a significant disruption occurred. The consensus from the sources is a covertly planted explosive caused the power blackout and equipment destruction inside the secure nuclear site.
Let's turn to who was blamed. Again, Iran unequivocally pointed the finger at Israel.
Yes. Foreign Minister Javad Zarif stated flatly the day after the attack that the Zionists want to take revenge for Iran's nuclear progress, and that Israel was behind the attack, vowing, "We will take our revenge against the Zionists at an appropriate time."
But I also added something about not falling into a trap.
Right. He coupled this with the assertion that Iran would not fall into the trap of halting diplomacy, suggesting Iran suspected Israel's specific motive was to provoke Iran into quitting the nuclear talks and thus scuttling the JCPOA revival. Iranian officials also formally complained to the UN, calling the sabotage a war crime, demanding the state responsible be held accountable.
Israel, again, maintained official silence, standard practice for them.
Correct, adhering to their policy of strategic ambiguity. However, Israeli media, according to the sources, widely and proudly reported the incident as a successful Mossad operation, citing unnamed intelligence sources who stated Israel's clandestine services had crippled Natanz through sabotage.
And Netanyahu made comments around that time too.
Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, without explicitly mentioning Natanz, declared around the same time that Israel would never allow Iran to obtain nuclear weapons, widely interpreted as hinting at ongoing covert actions.
And the timing was very specific during delicate nuclear talks.
Extremely. The day before the attack, Netanyahu had met with the U.S. Defense Secretary, and an Israeli Security Cabinet discussion on Iran was reportedly held, suggesting some level of foreknowledge. The U.S. denied any involvement and privately indicated this was an Israeli initiative.
What was the likely purpose of the Natanz attack, according to observers cited in the sources, given its timing during talks?
Observers noted the sabotage occurred specifically during sensitive negotiations in Vienna to restore the JCPOA, widely seen as an attempt by Israel, which opposed the deal, to undermine Iran's negotiating leverage or perhaps scuttle the talks entirely.
So while there was no formal claim of responsibility, virtually all signs and subsequent leaks pointed to Israel as the perpetrator of this covert strike on Natanz, a strike seamlessly aligned with Israel's long-standing campaign against Iran's nuclear program.
Seems to be the strong consensus in the material.
How did Iran react immediately? They vowed revenge, but how did that translate into action this time?
Iran's response combined strong rhetoric with calculated policy moves, echoing the Fakhrizadeh response. Officials condemned the cowardly sabotage and asserted Iran's right to retaliate. But crucially, they used the incident as justification for significant nuclear advancement. Within 2 days, Tehran announced it would boost uranium enrichment to 60% purity.
60%. That's a massive leap from the JCPOA limit of 3.67%, even beyond the 20% they'd started.
It is. It was an unprecedented level for Iran and a dramatic step closer to weapons-grade fuel, which is 90%. Iran's chief negotiator, Abbas Araki, who was in Vienna for the talks, explicitly stated that in response to the Natanz sabotage, Iran would begin 60% enrichment and install 1,000 additional advanced centrifuges at Natanz to replace the damaged ones.
So the response to a covert strike was a bold, overt nuclear escalation. That was Iran's nuclear response rate.
That was clearly the strategy, as described in the sources. This was portrayed as Iran's way of retaliating on the nuclear front without resorting to immediate military action that could spark a wider conflict. President Rouhani framed the enrichment hike as a response to evilness, calling it retaliation against Israel's nuclear terrorism.
And they did this while staying in the talks.
Importantly, yes. Iranian officials made this move while continuing to participate in the JCPOA talks, likely to avoid giving Israel the perceived victory of collapsing the negotiations.
Interesting tactic. Escalate nuclearly, but keep talking diplomatically.
The atmosphere in Iran was one of heightened tension and demands for revenge, alongside paranoia about infiltrators' arrests were announced later. Internationally, the Natanz attack drew admonitions. The EU and others warned such incidents could adversely affect the Vienna talks. The U.S. called Iran's 60% move provocative, even as it understood it was prompted by the Israeli action.
So a twofold response.
Iran's immediate response was strategically calibrated. Escalate the nuclear program in defiance, demonstrating it cannot be stopped, while holding off on direct military retaliation to avoid derailing diplomacy entirely or falling into a trap. This clearly illustrates how the covert Natanz strike pushed Iran to make overt, significant strategic shifts in its nuclear program.
What about the actual damage and the long-term strategic impact? Did the strike succeed in setting Iran back significantly?
It definitely caused a temporary setback, hobbling enrichment, mainly by taking out those older IR-1 centrifuges. As we mentioned, Iran vowed to replace them with more efficient IR-2 meters and IR-6 models, which, ironically, could potentially shorten their breakout time later on.
A double-edged sword for the attackers, perhaps?
Could be. Western intelligence believed the attack destroyed hundreds or even thousands of centrifuges and related infrastructure, potentially setting back the program at Natanz by months. In response, Iran began building new production halls deeper underground at Natanz in the weeks after the attack as a protective measure, going deeper for safety.
And strategically, the biggest impact was the jump to 60% enrichment.
Strategically, yes. The incident pushed Iran to expand its nuclear activity to its highest level ever. By mid-April 2021, Iran began producing 60% enriched uranium. That 60% figure, while not weapons grade, is a huge signal. It dramatically shortened the time needed to potentially produce weapons-grade fuel.
How did this affect diplomacy?
It significantly complicated diplomacy. While it might have given Iran more leverage in talks by showing capability, it also fueled deeper international skepticism about its intentions. Israel, seeing the operation as a tactical success in disrupting Natanz, nevertheless watched warily as Iran used it to justify accelerating enrichment even further.
So Natanz really showed this pattern. Covert strike, overt nuclear countermove.
In a broader sense, Natanz exemplified the pattern of the shadow war becoming visible. A covert Israeli strike, provoking an overt Iranian countermove, all happening below the threshold of conventional war, but increasingly open. That this sabotage occurred during talks in Vienna highlighted how the invisible conflict was directly intersecting with visible geopolitical efforts. Iranian officials warned the region was on the brink. By mid-2021, the Israel-Iran conflict had become far more overt, with actions and responses acknowledged publicly and having immediate policy consequences.
Let's quickly summarize this first key section before moving on.
Right. Section 1 focused on the pivotal events of the Fakhrizadeh assassination and the Natanz sabotage in 2020-2021, which significantly brought the shadow war into the open.
Here's a bullet point summary for retention. Fakhrizadeh, no, 2020. A top Iranian scientist killed in a sophisticated remote-controlled machine gun ambush outside Tehran, widely attributed to Israel. Remember, near Thanksgiving 2020, Fakhrizadeh gone. Impact of Fakhrizadeh. Hardened Iran's resolve, leading to a new law accelerating nuclear work, including 20% enrichment, as strategic revenge, implemented in early 2021. Natanz sabotage, April 2021. An explosion crippling power and damaging centrifuges at Iran's main enrichment site, also widely attributed to Israel, occurring disruptively during nuclear talks. Impact of Natanz. Iran retaliated on the nuclear front by announcing it would enrich uranium to 60% purity for the first time, April 17, high teens 60%, and install more advanced centrifuges, significantly advancing its program while maintaining participation in diplomacy. Overall, these two major covert operations triggered overt nuclear escalations and made the previously hidden conflict undeniable.
Now that we've seen how these specific events made the conflict visible, let's shift our focus to the larger diplomatic efforts or lack thereof during this period and the worrying parallel progress in Iran's nuclear program. All right.
We've explored how covert actions went overt, and now in Section 2, the challenging period from 2021 to 2023. This is when efforts to revive the 2015 nuclear deal, the JCPOA, ultimately collapsed, coinciding with a worrying acceleration in Iran's nuclear program towards weapons-grade levels.
That's a critical link the sources highlight. The JCPOA had essentially unraveled after the U.S. withdrawal in 2018, and by the start of 2021, Iran was already exceeding the deal's limits.
The baseline was already shaky.
Very shaky. The new U.S. administration under President Biden signaled a desire to revive the agreement, but Iran's program had continued to advance significantly in the years the deal was unraveling, creating a very difficult starting point for any diplomacy.
The sources detail the timeline of these JCPOA revival negotiations from 2021 to 2023, a process that was frequently interrupted and ultimately unsuccessful. It all started back in Vienna in April 2021.
Yes, on April 2, 2021, the JCPOA Joint Commission involving Iran and the remaining parties, the UK, France, Germany, Russia, and China, the P4+1, convened in Vienna for the first time since the U.S. exit. Consultations began aimed at restoring the deal, with working groups established to address the lifting of U.S. sanctions and Iran rolling back its nuclear steps. Progress in those early days was cautious and tentative.
And as we discussed, the Natanz sabotage happened just days into these talks, a major disruptor.
A clear disruption. On April 11, just 9 days after talks resumed, the Natanz sabotage attack occurred. Iran's swift retaliation, announced on April 13th, was to begin enriching uranium to 60% purity using advanced IR-6 centrifuges at Natanz. This was a level far beyond the JCPOA cap and Iran's first production of highly enriched uranium, or HEU.
How did the other parties react to that 60% move happening during the talks? That must have thrown a wrench in things.
It definitely did. Britain, France, and Germany called it a serious development with no credible civilian need, warning of complicated diplomacy. U.S. officials stated Iran's 60% enrichment calls into question its seriousness in the negotiations.
So doubts creeping in early.
Yes, but despite these disruptions, multiple negotiation rounds continued throughout April and May 2021. By mid-May, after 4 rounds, EU mediators reported an agreement is shaping up, although challenging issues remained. An Iranian draft text was apparently in progress. Momentum seemed positive, even as events outside the room threatened to derail it.
But then the talks paused in June 2021. Why the pause?
Right. A 6th round concluded on June 20, and the talks adjourned primarily due to Iran's presidential transition. Hardliner Ibrahim Raisi was elected on June 19, replacing the more moderate Hassan Rouhani, and Raisi's incoming team indicated they needed time before resuming diplomacy.
A changing of the guard in Tehran. Israel's reaction to Raisi's election was strong, wasn't it?
Very strong. Israel's then new Prime Minister Naftali Bennett seized on Raisi's victory, warned world powers to wake up, called Raisi a mass murderer, and argued forcefully against restoring the JCPOA with his government in charge.
And around the same time, there was a setback regarding IAEA monitoring, something about cameras.
Correct. Around mid-2021, Iran allowed a temporary monitoring arrangement with the IAEA put in place after suspending the additional protocol to lapse after June 24. Tehran refused to extend it, curtailing inspectors' access to surveillance data like camera footage.
So less visibility for the inspectors.
Exactly. IAEA Director General Rafael Grossi warned these monitoring gaps were seriously affecting the agency's continuity of knowledge about Iran's program. This added urgency to diplomacy, as Iran was reducing transparency while simultaneously advancing its nuclear work in parallel. A worrying combination.
So after a 5-month pause, talks resumed in November 2021 under the Raisi administration. Did the tone change?
Significantly, according to the sources. That was the 7th round in Vienna, starting November 29, 2021. This is where Iran took a significantly harder line. Its negotiators presented new proposals that European diplomats felt broke with almost all of the difficult compromises reached in the spring.
Walking back previous progress.
That's how the E3 saw it. Iran demanded substantial changes and linked unrelated issues, alarming the UK, France, and Germany. Talks made halting progress. The 7th round briefly adjourned in early December, then reconvened as the 8th round later that month.
What were some of these major sticking points that stalled the talks? in early 2022? You mentioned unrelated issues.
Two major demands stood out from the Raisi team. First, Tehran insisted the U.S. remove its Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, from a U.S. terrorism blacklist.
That's a big political ask.
Huge. Second, and perhaps most contentious, Iran demanded that the IAEA close its ongoing safeguards investigation into Iran's past undeclared nuclear activities. Western officials viewed both of these as extraneous to the JCPOA scope.
That IAEA probe issue, what was it about?
The IAEA investigation concerned findings of uranium traces at several undeclared sites in Iran, raising questions about possible past military dimensions of Iran's program, work potentially done before 2003. Iran insisted this investigation be closed as a condition for re-implementing the JCPOA.
So linking the current deal to closing the book on the past.
Precisely. The U.S. and E3 refused, stressing they would not politicize or preempt the independent IAEA process, and that the agency would only close the file when Iran provided technically credible, satisfactory answers. This became a critical deadlock.
And there was another issue, too, about guarantees.
Yes, another deadlock issue was Iran's request for guarantees that no future U.S. president would withdraw from the deal again, something the Biden administration legally couldn't provide given the structure of U.S. politics.
So trying to structure the talks like a complex puzzle, but the pieces kept changing shape or wouldn't fit. What were the main sticking points that stalled the talks in early 2022, leading to that impasse?
Based on the sources, the two biggest ones were Iran's demand for the U.S. to remove the IRGC from the terror list, and, even more fundamentally, its insistence that the IAEA close its probe into past undeclared nuclear activities before Iran would return to JCPOA compliance. The guarantee issue was also a factor.
So despite coming very close in early 2022, it stalled again over these specific political hurdles.
That's the picture painted by the sources. Intensive diplomacy through early 2022 brought them close by late February. U.S. and European officials said few technical and political decisions remained. A text was largely complete by mid-March 2022, after a brief pause caused by Russian demands related to Ukraine sanctions was resolved. Reports even suggested the U.S. was ready to lift some IRGC sanctions related to the deal, and Iran had tacitly dropped the IRGC issue by then. But the IAEA probe demand remained the major sticking point.
So it really came down to the IAEA probe at the very end.
It seems that way. By late March 2022, U.S. officials publicly doubted if the issues could be bridged. Iran claimed a deal was closer than ever, putting the onus on Washington. 11 months of revived talks effectively hit an impasse over these political issues, primarily the IAEA investigation.
Let's pause here for a quick micro recap of the negotiation timeline up to that point.
We've covered the timeline of JCPOA revival negotiations from the restart in Vienna in April 2021 through the disruptions like the Natanz attack and Iran's 60% enrichment response, the pause for Iranian elections, and the restart under Raisi in late 2021. We saw Iran presenting new, harder-line demands, particularly the IRGC delisting and closing the IAEA probe. Despite progress in near agreement in early 2022, the talks stalled primarily over these political obstacles, especially the IAEA investigation linkage.
So the talks stalled in early 2022. What happened in the middle of that year? Did things get better or worse?
Definitely worse. As the spring momentum for a deal evaporated, tensions rose again. In June 2022, the IAEA Board of Governors formally censured Iran for non-cooperation on the safeguards inquiry, with 30 out of 35 governors voting yes.
How did Iran react to the censure?
Iran retaliated swiftly and dramatically. It shut off or removed 27 IAEA surveillance cameras and other monitoring equipment at nuclear sites in early June.
Effectively blinding the inspectors to some extent, cutting off the eyes and ears.
Yes. This move severely curtailed inspectors' ability to track Iran's activities and maintain continuity of knowledge. Director General Grossi issued a dire warning on June 9. If monitoring wasn't restored quickly, within 3 to 4 weeks, it would be a fatal blow to reviving the JCPOA, as the IAEA would lose the ability to accurately reconstruct Iran's nuclear history. European powers condemned Iran's action as aggravating.
Did they try talking again after that?
Against this backdrop of escalating tension, the EU convened an indirect U.S.-Iranian meeting in Doha, Qatar, on June 28-29, 2022, hoping for a breakthrough. However, the Doha talks failed to make progress. The EU's envoy reported they did not produce the progress hoped for.
Why did Doha fail?
Both sides blamed the other, with U.S. Special Envoy Rob Malley saying Iran had not yet made the fundamental decision to revive the deal, as Tehran raised issues extraneous to the agreement. With talks again at a standstill and Iran's nuclear advancements continuing, International focus shifted to one last attempt in late summer.
Was that the final EU proposal we heard about?
Yes. In August 2022, the European Union put forward what it called a final draft text to restore the JCPOA after 15 months of negotiations. EU coordinator Josep Borrell declared what can be negotiated has been negotiated, urging both sides to accept or reject it. The text reportedly included creative language to address Iran's safeguards concerns without undermining the IAEA's mandate.
So, a last-ditch effort. How did Iran respond to that final text?
By mid-August, Iran submitted its response. Tehran's reply accepted the basis, but still pressed for assurances on IAEA safeguards and economic guarantees. European officials had mixed reactions. Some saw glimmers of hope, others noted tricky new issues. The U.S. reviewed the response. However, by early September 2022, it became clear the remaining gaps couldn't be closed. Iran continued to insist the IAEA close its files on the undeclared sites up front, which Western officials deemed impossible.
Still stuck on the IAEA probe.
Fundamentally, on September 10, 2022, the E3, the UK, France, and Germany issued a joint statement expressing serious doubts about Iran's commitment and stating Iran has chosen not to seize this critical diplomatic opportunity, specifically criticizing Iran for linking the JCPOA revival to the safeguards probe. The United States also rejected Iran's final demands as unreasonable.
So the EU's last push failed. The deal was effectively dead then.
It did. By mid-September, no agreement was reached, marking the collapse of the JCPOA revival negotiations. The aftermath saw further escalation. In November 2022, Iran responded to another IAEA board censure by enriching uranium to 60% at a second site, Fordo, and installing additional advanced centrifuges there.
Doubling down after the talks failed.
This was a clear signal of defiance, demonstrating Iran's ability to expand its program despite international pressure. With 60% production happening at two fortified sites, the window for diplomacy appeared to close, leaving Iran's nuclear program advancing unchecked.
In 2023, was there any movement towards a deal at all? What was the status of JCPOA talks in 2023?
Throughout 2023, formal JCPOA negotiations remained in deep freeze. It was essentially off the table. The environment was hostile. Iran faced domestic turmoil from nationwide protests that erupted in late 2022, and its military support for Russia in the Ukraine war hardened U.S. and European reluctance for any deal providing significant sanctions relief.
U.S. policy shifted then, no longer focused on revival.
Yes. U.S. officials stated in early 2023 that reviving the 2015 deal was not on the table. Diplomacy shifted to quiet de-escalation discussions, aiming to prevent the situation from spiraling into conflict. These discussions, primarily via intermediaries like Oman, explored interim understandings.
Like the prisoner swap, was that part of this de-escalation?
Exactly. The sources indicate that in mid-2023, Iran reportedly slowed its accumulation of 60% enriched uranium and avoided new provocations, aligning with reports of an informal understanding. The U.S. facilitated limited Iranian oil sales and a humanitarian prisoner exchange. IAEA reports from mid-2023 suggested Iran's 60% enrichment output dropped significantly, potentially a result of a tacit understanding. This culminated in the U.S.-Iran prisoner swap in August 2023 with the release of $6 billion in frozen funds, seen as a confidence-building step.
But it wasn't a return to the JCPOA, just managing the immediate risks.
Precisely. And even that limited cooperation was fragile. In September 2023, Iran moved in the opposite direction on oversight, withdrawing the accreditation of several experienced IAEA inspectors from key European countries. Grossi condemned this as unprecedented and extreme and unjustified, a serious impediment to verification.
Undermining the inspectors again.
Yes. By late 2023, Iranian officials like Foreign Minister Hossein Amir-Abdollahian were openly questioning the JCPOA's value, calling it useless since Iran wasn't benefiting, although leaving the door slightly ajar if restored accords served their interests.
And regional tensions didn't ease.
No, they remained high. Israel's government, led again by Benjamin Netanyahu from late 2022, intensified warnings, stating Israel will not be bound by weak understandings and would act to prevent an Iranian bomb. Israeli and U.S. militaries conducted large joint exercises in 2023, simulating strikes on Iran's facilities, signaling readiness. By 2023, diplomatic focus had shifted entirely from reviving the deal to managing the fallout of its failure, leaving Iran's program advancing without constraints or adequate verification. The atmosphere was one of deep freeze, really.
So, as diplomacy failed, Iran's nuclear program didn't just continue, it accelerated significantly. Our sources track a worrying progression in uranium enrichment from 2021 into 2024.
That parallel track is critical. From 2021 onwards, while JCPOA talks sputtered, Iran's program made rapid strides toward weapons-grade uranium. Under the JCPOA, Iran was limited to enriching uranium-235 to 3.67% purity and keeping a minimal stockpile, around 300 kilograms of low-enriched uranium, LEU.
Remind us, what's the difference between LEU and HEU?
LEU is typically below 20% enrichment, suitable for power reactors. HEU, high-enriched uranium, is 20% or above. Weapons grade is usually considered 90% HEU.
Got it. So Iran started breaching those LEU limits.
Systematically. After the deal's effective collapse, Iran systematically breached these limits. The period from 2021 to 2024 saw its estimated breakout time, the time needed to produce enough fissile material for one bomb shrink, from about a year under the JCPOA to, according to some sources, essentially zero.
Zero breakout time. That's alarming. Let's trace those steps, starting in 2021.
Early in 2021, Iran began openly exceeding JCPOA levels, partly fulfilling the law passed after the Fakhrizadeh assassination. On January 4, 2021, let's remember, Jan 4, 20% door opens. Iran resumed enriching uranium to 20% U-235 at the Fordo underground site, a level not seen since 2013. The IAEA confirmed they quickly accumulated a quantity of this 20% material.
Was 20% considered a big step towards a bomb? How significant is that jump?
Yes. It's a significant step, technically. IAEA Director General Grossi warned that getting to 20%, which represents about 90% of the effort needed to reach weapons grade, 90% meant we don't have many months, we have weeks to save the JCPOA. Indeed, by February 2021, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was already floating the idea of going higher, stating Iran might enrich up to 60% if needed.
And they followed through on that threat after the Natanz sabotage.
They did. After the April 2021 Natanz attack, Iran acted. Starting April 17, 2021, remember April 17, high teen, 60%, Iran began feeding UF-Uros into advanced centrifuges, IR-6s, at Natanz, producing uranium at 60% purity. The IAEA confirmed this development promptly.
Why is 60% enrichment so significant? Weapons grade is 90%. What makes 60% such a threshold?
Enriching to 60% crosses a major technical hurdle. It puts Iran into high-enriched uranium, or HEU, territory. Think of the path to 90% like climbing a steep ladder towards a target. Natural uranium, 0.7% U-235 is the bottom rung, 3.67% is a step up, 20% is a big climb higher. But getting to 60% is like climbing most of the way up that ladder. The amount of work, measured in separative work units, SWU, to get from 60% to 90% is relatively small compared to the enormous work required to get from natural uranium all the way up to 60%. So producing 60% HEU in quantity means Iran has done the vast majority of the difficult technical work needed for bomb material. It's perilously close.
So reaching 60% is like getting to the 1-yard line in American football. Very close to the goal.
That's a good analogy. By the end of 2021, Iran had accumulated a concerning, though still modest, stockpile of 60% HEU. The IAEA reported in February 2022 that Iran had about 33 kilograms of 60% material, alongside over 180 kilograms of 20% HEU.
And centrifuges, were they upgrading those too?
Yes, significantly. Iran also installed hundreds of advanced centrifuges, IR-2 meters, IR-4, IR-6 models at Natanz and Fordo in 2021. Vastly increasing its potential enrichment capacity beyond what was allowed under the JCPOA. They also began experiments with uranium metal production from 20% HEU, a material with direct weapons applications violating another JCPOA ban.
How did these steps affect the estimated time for Iran to produce enough material for a bomb, the breakout time?
Collectively, these steps drastically reduced the estimated breakout time, the hypothetical time Iran would need to produce enough bomb-grade material for one weapon if it decided to, from about 12 months under the JCPOA down to only a few months by late 2021. Western officials were sounding alarms. Israel's energy minister warned in February 2021 that Iran could produce weapons-sufficient fissile material in about 6 months.
Okay, let's do a quick micro recap on the 2021 nuclear steps.
So in 2021, Iran resumed 20% enrichment in January, Jan 4, 20% door, then initiated 60% enrichment in April 17, high teens, 60%, began installing hundreds of advanced centrifuges, and conducted uranium metal experiments, all of which combined to shrink its estimated breakout time significantly, down from a year to just a few months.
Let's look at 2022. With no deal in place, Iran continued to push forward. What happened with stockpiles?
Yes. By March 2022, IAEA measurements showed Iran's total enriched uranium stockpile at all levels had swelled to about 3,200 kilograms, more than 10 times the JCPOA cap of 300 kilograms. This included 33 kilograms of 60% HEU and about 182 kilograms of 20%.
You mentioned something called a significant quantity earlier. What does that mean?
Right. It's an important technical term. The IAEA considers 42 kilograms of 60% uranium a significant quantity, or SASQ. This is the approximate amount of nuclear material for which the possibility of manufacturing a nuclear explosive device cannot be excluded. So it's roughly enough fissile material for one bomb's core, if further enriched.
And by March 2022, Iran was nearing that threshold with its 33 kilograms of 60%.
Exactly. They're getting very close to having one SQ's worth of 60% HEU.
And the breakout time continued to shrink.
Yes. U.S. officials in early 2022 estimated Iran's breakout time had plummeted to mere weeks, a drastic decline from approximately 1 year under JCPOA compliance. Throughout 2022, Iran continued installing advanced machines.
And transparency decreased further.
Yes. In June 2022, after being censured by the IAEA board, Iran disconnected those 27 surveillance cameras and later deactivated online enrichment monitors at sites like Natanz, further blinding inspectors. Director General Grossi issued dire warnings that a looming knowledge gap would soon make it impossible to reconstruct Iran's nuclear injury, potentially undermining the basis for any future deal. Grossi called the program on a ventilator in terms of monitoring.
By August 2022, when the EU put forward its final text, how large was the 60% stockpile?
According to unofficial estimates cited in the sources, Iran's 60% stockpile had grown to around 55-60 kilograms by August 2022, exceeding 1Q. Its 20% stock was over 300 kilograms. Some assessments shortened the breakout time to perhaps less than 1 month.
And then, following the collapse of talks in the fall of 2022, came more escalation. What did Iran do?
Exactly. After the collapse, Iran escalated further. On November 22, 2022, Iran announced it would begin enriching uranium to 60% at the Fordow fuel enrichment plant, its second, more fortified underground site. They also plan to install 12 more advanced IR-6 centrifuge cascades there.
Enriching 60% at 2 sites? How significant was that increase?
Yes, enriching at both Natanz and Fordow effectively tripled its capacity for producing 60% HEU. The IAEA confirmed Iran swiftly began feeding uranium into advanced centrifuges at Fordow, achieving 60% production at this second site.
So by the end of 2022,
By the end of 2022, Iran was openly producing 60% HEU at 2 sites and amassing a stockpile that significantly exceeded the significant quantity for one bomb. Western capitals repeatedly warned this had no civilian justification and brought Iran dangerously close to weapons grade.
Israeli officials were increasingly vocal with warnings too, weren't they?
Increasingly so. Defense Minister Benny Gantz revealed intelligence in May 2022 about Iran working on 1,000 new advanced centrifuges underground and stated Israel will not allow Iran to become nuclear armed, hinting at potential preemptive strikes. So 2022 ended with Iran positioned just below the 90% threshold, having significantly expanded both its enrichment level and quantity of HEU.
This brings us to early 2023, when the alarm seemed to peak. What happened then?
It did. In late January 2023, IAEA inspectors taking environmental samples at Fordow discovered trace particles of uranium enriched to 83.7% U-235. That is extremely close to weapons-grade 90%. Imagine finding a weighting just shy of the target on a critical gauge, a real near miss.
84%. How is that explained?
This finding was publicly confirmed by the IAEA in February 2023. The agency was in discussions with Iran to explain the origin of these near weapons-grade particles. Iran claimed it didn't intentionally enrich beyond 60%, attributing the finding to unintended fluctuations during a cascade configuration change in November 2022.
Unintended fluctuations. Did the IAEA buy that?
The sources note that it was apparently a transient spike, and no significant quantity of 84% material was collected or stockpiled. Nonetheless, the incident underscored how incredibly close Iran was to the bomb-grade mark, a mere technical step away.
And the 60% stockpile kept growing.
Yes. In its February 2023 quarterly report, the IAEA also documented the growth of Iran's 60% HEU stockpile. It had grown by about 25 kilograms since the last report, reaching 87.5 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium.
87.5 kilograms. That's more than double the significant quantity for one bomb, right?
That's correct. That stock was now more than double the 42-kilogram SQ needed for one bomb.
And what did that do to the breakout time estimate?
Weapons experts noted that if Iran decided to enrich its 60% material to 90%, it could produce a bomb's worth of weapons-grade uranium in a matter of days or weeks. A U.S. Defense Department official told Congress in late February that Iran would need only 12 days to enrich enough weapons-grade uranium for one bomb, given its capacity and stockpile.
12 days. Let's focus on that. What was the estimated breakout time in early 2023, according to that U.S. official?
According to that testimony, the breakout time was estimated at only 12 days. essentially near zero.
12 days. That basically means the breakout time had shrunk to near zero, just days. A critical threshold crossed.
Exactly. The estimated time had gone from about a year under the deal to mere weeks or even days. Israel's response to these developments was sharp. Israeli officials reportedly warned the US and Europe in March 2023 that enrichment above 60% would be a trigger for military action.
A trigger for military action.
While they didn't view the small 84% spike as the trigger itself, they signaled that any sustained enrichment above 60%, such as moving to 90% or deliberately stockpiling 84% material, would cross Israel's red line.
So a sustained effort above 60% was the key.
That seems to be the line they drew. In public, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and Defense Minister Gallant ramped up threats, and Israel accelerated preparations for a potential strike, including seeking accelerated delivery of U.S. aerial refueling tankers needed for long-range operations.
Preparing for a potential strike.
Thus, by early 2023, the combination of Iran's growing HEU stockpile and the 84% revelation created a high-stakes flashpoint. Iran was a short technical step from weapons grade, and Israel and the West were openly warning of military consequences if it took that final step. It was a moment of extreme tension.
So, in 2023 and into 2024, even with some fluctuations, Iran continued to build its nuclear capabilities, possessing enough material for multiple bombs.
Yes. Throughout 2023 and into 2024, Iran continued to enlarge its enrichment program, although the output rate fluctuated. After the 84% scare in early 2023, Iran seemed to exercise some caution. From approximately June through August 2023, the IAEA observed a decrease in the rate of 60% production by about 2/3.
Was that linked to the quiet talks with the U.S. that led to the prisoner swap, the de-escalation attempts?
The sources note this slowdown corresponded with reports of an informal understanding with the U.S. aimed at de-escalation. However, following the regional turmoil ignited by the October 2023 Gaza war and the breakdown of those understandings, Iran re-accelerated its enrichment.
So the slowdown didn't last?
No. An IAEA update in November 2023 indicated Iran was again producing about 9 kilograms of 60% HEU per month, returning to its previous peak rate.
And the stockpile size by late 2023, how many bombs worth?
By November 2023, Iran's total stockpile of 60% enriched uranium was estimated at about 130 kilograms uranium mass, enough, in theory, for about 2 nuclear bombs if further enriched to weapons grade. Confidential IAEA reports at that time reportedly assessed that Iran had accumulated enough 60% uranium for 3 atomic bombs, if refined to 90%.
Enough for 2 or 3 bombs worth of material by late 2023. That's a significant amount.
It is. Iran also continued to impede full inspections. In September 2023, Tehran revoked the credentials of 8 senior IAEA inspectors from key European countries, further hindering the agency's oversight capacity and ability to verify its declarations.
Making it harder for the world to see what they were doing.
Meanwhile, Iran's overall enriched uranium stockpile at all grades reached about 4,500 kilograms by late October 2023, around 22 times the JCPOA's limit, reflecting the large quantities of low-enriched uranium accumulated alongside the HEU.
What was the trajectory looking into 2024 and even slightly beyond, based on the latest information in the sources? Did that stockpile keep growing?
Looking into 2024, absent any diplomatic breakthrough, Iran showed no sign of reversing its nuclear expansion. While IAEA monitoring was partially restored in March 2023 after some negotiation, critical gaps remain due to the earlier removal of cameras and the barring of inspectors. By early 2024, open-source analyses and later IAEA reports indicated Iran's 60% stockpile continued to grow.
How much did it grow?
For instance, an IAEA report in February 2025 mentioned in the source as reflecting the trajectory leading up to late 2024, put Iran's 60% inventory at a significant 274.8 kilograms.
Nearly 275 kilograms of 60% by early 2025. How many bombs worth is that?
Yes. The sources note this was a substantial increase, reflecting a potentially accelerated production rate in late 2024, after diplomacy fully stalled. That amount of HEU is estimated to be enough for approximately 4 to 5 nuclear bombs if further enriched.
4 to 5 bombs, so the stockpile went from enough for maybe 1 in early 2023 to 2 or 3 by late 2023, and then enough for 4 or 5 by the end of 2024, early 2025. That's rapid growth.
It's a trajectory of continuous worrying growth that brings Iran closer and closer to having enough material for multiple weapons. This trajectory drastically reduces confidence in any stated peaceful rationale for Iran's program. The U.S. and European partners have repeatedly stated that no other non-nuclear weapon state has ever enriched uranium to 60%, calling it gravely concerning.
And Israeli rhetoric remains sharp.
Intense. In July 2022, President Biden and Israel's then PM Lapid affirmed the U.S.'s unshakable commitment to prevent an Iranian nuclear weapon, pledging all elements of national power, if necessary, in the Jerusalem Declaration. By 2023-24, Netanyahu's government echoed this, frequently citing a military option. In summary, as of 2024, Iran is technically closer than ever to possessing weapons-grade uranium capability. The production of 60% HEU at scale and isolated instances of near-weapons-grade material have significantly shortened the timeline for Iran to build a nuclear weapon, should it choose to do so.
Creating a crisis atmosphere.
This has created a sense of urgency and crisis internationally, with the IAEA, UNSC, and regional players warning the situation is untenable. Grossi urged Iran to roll back, cautioning that continued nuclear escalation would have consequences on the regional security landscape. Israeli leaders have hinted time for a non-military resolution is running out. Iran's enrichment advances from 2021 to 2024, unconstrained by the JCPOA, have eroded non-proliferation and increased the risk of an Israeli-Iranian confrontation.
Let's do a mega recap for this section on diplomacy and nuclear advances. This was dense but crucial.
Section 2 covered the step-by-step failure of diplomacy to revive the JCPOA and the parallel rapid acceleration of Iran's nuclear enrichment program towards weapons-grade levels during 2021-2023, with trends continuing into 2024.
Here's a bullet point summary for attention. Diplomatic failure, 2021-2023. Efforts to revive the JCPOA collapsed due to factors like leadership changes in Iran, hardline demands, especially linking revival to closing the IAEA probe, lack of U.S. guarantees, and external events, despite coming close at times. By 2023, talks were in a deep freeze, IAEA monitoring gaps. Iran significantly reduced cooperation and inspector access, removing cameras, revoking accreditations, severely limiting the agency's ability to verify its program and maintain continuity of knowledge. Enrichment escalation. Iran rapidly increased enrichment from 3.67% to 20%, Jan 4, 20% door, then 60%, April 17, high teens, 60%, starting in 2021, expanded 60% production to a second site, Fardo, in late 2022, and even produced traces near 84% in early 2023. Stockpile growth. Iran amassed a significant stockpile of 60% PESHU, exceeding the significant quantity for one bomb by early 2023, 87.5 kilograms, growing to enough for 233 bombs by late 2023, 120, 30, and 30 kilograms, and projected to reach enough for 445 bombs by late 2024, early 2025, based on Feb 2025 report of 275 kilograms. Breakout time. The estimated time needed to enrich enough material for one bomb shrunk from about a year under the JCPOA to mere weeks or even days, estimated 12 days by US DoD, by early 2023. Strategic shift. The collapse of diplomacy and Iran's nuclear advances created a high-stakes situation, shifting international focus towards containment, pressure, and potential military options for the US, Israel, and Europe.
Beyond nuclear progress and failed talks, this period also saw a strong focus on pressure campaigns against Iran and a clear increase in retaliatory attacks from its proxies across the region.
We've examined how covert actions became overt and how nuclear diplomacy failed while Iran's program accelerated. Now, in Section 3, we're looking at the pressure campaigns waged against Iran by the US and Israel and the resulting blowback in the form of increasingly overt attacks by Iran and its proxies across the region. The sources show that this is where the invisible conflict truly began to show its teeth more regularly.
That's right. In the absence of a nuclear deal, the US and Israel intensified their coordinated efforts to pressure Iran. This was paired with a notable increase in attacks by Iranian-aligned groups. It wasn't exactly the same as the Trump era's maximum pressure, but elements were certainly revived, often more quietly.
How did this coordination work? What did the sources describe beyond just policy statements?
Well, early in 2021, President Biden's team reconvened a top-secret U.S.-Israel strategic forum codenamed OPAL to synchronize Iran policy and plan contingencies. These weren't public meetings, but high-level coordination channels.
OPAL. So secret talks were happening.
Yes. And in September 2021, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and his Israeli counterpart discussed a Plan B if nuclear talks failed, with the U.S. reportedly agreeing that additional sanctions would follow if Iran stalled diplomacy. This signaled a shared intent to maintain pressure and have alternatives ready.
Did Israel propose its own ideas for pressure?
When Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett visited Washington in August 2021, he presented a death-by-a-thousand-cuts strategy against Iran. Imagine lots of small, persistent actions. The idea was focusing on small-scale actions against Iran's regional aggression alongside addressing the nuclear file, rather than one big strike.
Death by a thousand cuts, a strategy of persistent, smaller hits.
That was the concept presented. Meanwhile, the Biden administration, despite seeking a nuclear deal revival, kept many Trump-era sanctions intact on oil exports, the IRGC terror listing and coordinated contingency plans with Israel, thereby tacitly extending the maximum pressure doctrine even while pursuing talks.
So even while hoping for a deal, the pressure tools remained firmly in place, and there were very public demonstrations of unity and military readiness, right?
This revived pressure doctrine was significantly undergirded by an upgraded military deterrence posture. The U.S. and Israel conducted joint military exercises of unprecedented scale and visibility to demonstrate readiness. In January 2023, they staged Juniper Oak, described as the largest ever bilateral exercise.
Juniper Oak, that name itself sounds substantial. What did that involve? How big was it?
It was massive, nearly 8,000 troops, 142 aircraft, including US B-52 bombers and Israeli F-35s, naval vessels, and cyber units operating together. Think about that sheer scale: warships, strategic bombers, stealth fighters, thousands of personnel. The explicit goals were improve interoperability and deter adversaries, particularly Iran, by showcasing America's ability to surge forces into the region.
Were they practicing strike runs on Iran?
While U.S. officials denied practicing actual Iran strike runs, the types of missions exercise mid-air refueling, strike coordination, defeating air defenses are central to any potential conflict with Iran. What stands out to you about the purpose of those large joint exercises like Juniper Oak?
It seems like a very clear, nonverbal message to Tehran. It wasn't just about technical practice, it was projecting the potential for overwhelming joint force, showing that attacking one could mean facing both, and demonstrating the capability to sustain complex operations far from home. The sources calling it Iran's nightmare scenario seems apt.
I agree, it was powerful signaling. And this robust posture extended beyond one exercise. In spring 2022, as Iran talks stalled, Israel's Chariots of Fire drill, simulating a strike on Iran's nuclear sites, notably included U.S. Air Force refueling tankers operating in or alongside the drill.
U.S. tankers helping Israeli strike practice. That's a very strong signal of implicit support, isn't it?
It is. It was seen as an unprecedented level of cooperation that Israel hailed as U.S. support for its strike option. Throughout 2022 and 2023, senior U.S. officials held intensive consultations with Israeli counterparts, coordinating air defense deployments and sharing intelligence on Iranian threats.
And this tied into regional defense efforts, too.
Yes. By late 2022, with diplomacy faltering, Washington began openly bolstering regional defenses, integrating Mideast partner radars to counter Iranian missiles and drones, in sync with Israel's calls for a tougher stance, and leveraging that CNE and TCOM integration shift we discussed earlier.
So what were the main components of this revived maximum pressure approach, based on the sources?
It had multiple layers: sustained economic sanctions, secret strategic coordination, OPAL, likely continuation of clandestine operations against key programs, and critically, this highly visible military signaling through joint exercises like Juniper Oak and tanker support for Israeli drills, plus integrating regional defenses. It was pressure through economic, covert, diplomatic, and overt military means. In sum, since 2021, the U.S. and Israel pursued this dual track, applying economic pressure and employing covert action to stall Iran's nuclear advances, while simultaneously engaging in visible military preparedness to back up their red lines. U.S. officials acknowledged that demonstrating credible force was necessary for deterrence. The outcome by 2023 was a de facto revival of maximum pressure, contributing to the increasingly undeniable nature of the shadow war. Let's pause for a quick micro recap on that pressure campaign. Okay, we just covered the U.S.-Israel coordination efforts that revived elements of maximum pressure, including secret talks, OPAL, keeping sanctions, Bennett's Thousand Cuts idea, and very visible large-scale joint military exercises like Juniper Oak and U.S. tanker support for Israeli drills, all aimed at deterring Iran.
Now let's look at the blowback side of things, the attacks carried out by Iran and its proxies. Our sources provide a chronology of these drone and missile strikes on Israeli-linked targets between 2021 and 2024, showing a clear pattern of growing boldness and overtness.
That's right. Between 2021 and 2024, Iran and its regional proxies, including Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, and various pro-Iran militias in Iraq and Syria, launched numerous attacks targeting Israeli interests. These incidents, which used to be maybe deniable, became harder to dismiss, frequently occurring in retaliation for perceived Israeli actions, and clearly demonstrating how the conflict was edging into the open.
Let's walk through some of the significant examples from the sources, starting in 2021. What happened early that year? Jan 29, 2021. In New Delhi, India, an IED bomb was planted near the Israeli embassy. It caused a minor blast but no injuries. This was attributed to a suspected IRGC-linked cell, a small incident, but targeted an embassy. Then things moved to the sea. February 25, 2021. In the Gulf of Oman, the MV Helios Ray cargo ship, which was Israeli-owned, was hit by what was believed to be a limpet mine or small bomb attached to the hull. It pierced the hull but caused no crew casualties. Iran was suspected. PM Netanyahu directly blamed Tehran. April 13, 2021, just days after the Natanz sabotage off Fujairah, UAE, another Israeli-linked ship, the MV Hyperion Ray vehicle carrier, was struck by a missile, causing explosion damage. Widely seen as Iranian retaliation for Natanz. And then a particularly serious maritime attack. June 30, 2021. Yes, this was a major escalation. In the Arabian Sea off Oman, the MT Mercer Street tanker, managed by an Israeli-owned company, was attacked by an explosive suicide drone. This drone slammed into the bridge, killing 2 crew members, a British and a Romanian national. It was attributed to an IRGC UAV unit, though Iran officially denied involvement. This incident marked the first fatalities directly linked to attacks in this maritime shadow war, according to the sources. A real line crossed. Fatalities changed the game. What about land attacks? August 6, 2021. In northern Israel, specifically the Sheba Farms area near the border, there was a rocket barrage of 19 Katyusha rockets launched from Lebanon. While it caused no casualties, many intercepted, others landing in open areas, it was claimed by Hezbollah as retaliation for earlier Israeli airstrikes. It was seen as a carefully calibrated response aimed at empty lands to release pressure without triggering a war. Moving into 2022, the attacks continued and became more explicit in their attribution. What stands out from that year? March 13, 2022. This one was significant. In Erbil, the capital of Iraqi Kurdistan, a villa reportedly belonging to an Israeli-linked businessman involved in energy was struck by a volley of approximately 12 F-810 ballistic missiles launched from Iran. The building was wrecked and 1 civilian was injured. Ballistic missiles from Iran itself.
Yes. What was notable here is that the IRGC in Iran claimed responsibility for this strike, stating it hit an Israeli strategic center. This was a rare direct Iranian missile strike outside of Iran's immediate borders, explicitly framed as avenging recent Israeli airstrikes in Syria that killed IRGC personnel, much less than.
What else in 2022? June 2, 2022. Toward the Karish gas field in the Mediterranean Sea, an area disputed between Israel and Lebanon at the time, 3 unmanned drones were launched from Lebanon. They were shot down by Israeli naval defense. Hezbollah claimed this was a recon mission meant to send a message, possibly related to the ongoing maritime border negotiations. November 15, 2022. Back in the Gulf of Oman, the MV Pacific Zircon oil tanker, operated by a Singapore-based firm linked to an Israeli billionaire, was hit by a Shahed 126 drone. This caused minor hull damage but no injuries. It was attributed to the IRGC using an Iranian-made drone launched from somewhere in the region. And these proxy attacks intensified dramatically after the Israel-Hamas war began in October 2023, didn't they?
The region caught fire. October 19, 2023, multiple. In the Red Sea off Yemen, the U.S. Navy destroyer USS Carney intercepted 3 land attack cruise missiles and 8 drones launched by the Houthi rebels, Ansar Allah. U.S. defense officials confirmed these projectiles were potentially towards Israel. While intercepted, this incident starkly showed how a local conflict in Gaza could quickly spill over into a multi-front regional engagement threatening international assets and even forcing U.S. intervention.
The Houthis getting directly involved against Israel. Oknov 2023, multiple. Along the northern Israel border with Lebanon, Hezbollah significantly escalated sporadic rocket and missile attacks into Israel. These strikes caused several Israeli soldier casualties and damage to infrastructure, marking Hezbollah's open, albeit initially calibrated, engagement supporting Hamas during the Gaza war, leading to exchanges of fire. November 19, 2023. In the Red Sea, the cargo ship Galaxy Leader was dramatically hijacked by armed Houthi rebels rappelling from a helicopter. The ship, identified as having links to an Israeli company, was seized and its crew of around 25 taken hostage. The Houthis claimed it as an Israeli ship and declared all ships connected to Israel fair game in the Red Sea, directly threatening international shipping lanes. That list of incidents, spread across different regions, shows a clear pattern. What were the main types of targets hit by Iran and its proxies during this period, based on that list?
It's quite diverse. They hit Israeli-linked commercial shipping repeatedly in the Gulf of Oman, Arabian Sea, and Red Sea. They targeted infrastructure near an Israeli embassy, India. They struck alleged Israeli intelligence or business sites in third countries, Erbil, Iraq. They targeted Israeli energy infrastructure, Kurdish gas field attempt. They launched rockets and missiles towards Israeli territory from Lebanon and Yemen, and they even hijacked a commercial vessel entirely. It shows a broad spectrum approach.
What's the strategic context here? How did this erode deniability?
It illustrates Iran's expanding reliance on and use of drones, missiles, and regional proxy forces to target Israeli interests across diverse geographic areas. The attacks grew bolder, frequently framed as retaliation for perceived Israeli actions. Incidents like the Mercer Street fatalities and the Erbil missile strike, which the IRGC explicitly claimed as revenge, made it much harder to maintain plausible deniability.
Hezbollah's role changed too.
Yes. Hezbollah's role evolved from calibrated, almost symbolic attacks to satisfying internal pressure, like August 2021, to more direct signaling, July 2022 gas-rigged drones, and then to open, sustained border conflict after October 2023. The Houthis, already a potent force, became a direct threat to Israel and international shipping. By 2024, the cumulative effect was undeniable. The once shadowy Israel-Iran conflict had burst into the open. There was regular exchange of ordnance between Iran's proxies and Israel. What used to be strictly covert or thinly veiled was now often brazenly claimed. Iran sought to deter Israel and impose costs for its campaigns between wars. Responses included U.S. intercepts like the USS Carney, intensified Israeli military actions, which we'll discuss next section, and that broader U.S.-Israeli deterrence posture we covered. Let's do a mega recap for Section 3 on pressure and blowback. Right. Section 3 covered the revival of pressure on Iran through U.S.-Israel coordination and the subsequent increase in drone and missile attacks by Iran and its proxies across the region between 2021 and 2024.
Here's a bullet point summary for retention. U.S.-Israel coordination revived a de facto maximum pressure approach through secret strategic forums, OPAL, keeping sanctions, and conducting large joint military exercises like Juniper Oak, Jan 2023, and including U.S. tankers and Israeli strike drills, spring 2022, to signal military readiness and deterrence. Iranian proxy attacks. From 2021-2024, Iran and groups like Hezbollah and the Houthis launched numerous drone and missile strikes on Israeli-linked targets across the region, including cargo ships, Mercer Street 2021, fatal attack, Pacific Zircon 2022, near the Israeli embassy in India 2021, an alleged Israeli site in Iraq, Erbil 2022, direct IRGC claim, an Israeli gas field Karish 2022 attempt, and towards Israel itself, Hezbollah border attacks, Houthi missiles drones 2023, plus a ship hijacking, Galaxy Leader 2023. Drawing avertness. These attacks became bolder, sometimes directly attributed or claimed by Iran proxies like the Erbil strike or Houthi actions, eroding the plausible deniability of the shadow war. Post-Oct 2023 escalation. The Israel-Hamas war dramatically intensified proxy activity, particularly by Hezbollah and the Houthis, leading to more open exchanges of fire and threatening international shipping in the Red Sea.
This takes us to our next point. How these escalating tensions led to significant shifts in regional military postures and highlighted the challenges of understanding each side's critical red lines.
We've tracked the path from covert sparks to overt proxy blowback and nuclear acceleration, and the pressure campaigns involved. In Section 4, we're examining how these escalating tensions triggered shifts in regional military postures and brought the concept of red lines. Those actions each side declared it would not tolerate into sharp focus. The sources suggest that testing or misreading these red lines further increased the conflict's visibility.
That's right. As the conflict became more visible, the military landscape across the region also shifted dynamically. The U.S. and regional partners adapted their postures, initially with some adjustments aimed at de-escalation, but eventually toward heightened deterrence as threats ramped up.
What were those initial adjustments in 2021?
Well, in early 2021, the U.S. initially signaled a de-escalation in the Gulf as it pursued diplomacy with Iran. The Biden administration removed or redeployed key missile defense units that had been temporarily surged to the region under Trump.
Like Patriot batteries being pulled back.
Yes. In June 2021, the U.S. withdrew Patriot batteries from Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, and Jordan, as well as a Tajad anti-missile system from Saudi soil. Officials characterized this as a return to more normal force levels amid hopes for easing tensions with Iran.
How did Gulf partners react to that?
According to sources, this drawdown caused some nervousness among Gulf partners, who worried about Iran's threat going unchecked as U.S. assets departed. However, despite this reduction in some assets, a really significant strategic realignment occurred in September 2021 when Israel was officially moved from the U.S. European Command ECOM to U.S. Central Command's CENTCOM's area of responsibility.
Why was that shift important, Israel moving to CENTCOM?
It was a long-awaited shift, reflecting the new reality of Israeli-Arab normalization, the Abraham Accords, and their shared focus on the threat from Iran. Geographically, Israel sits right next to the CENTCOM region. Integrating Israel into CENTCOM laid the groundwork for closer intelligence sharing, planning, and even joint exercises among the U.S., Israel, and some Arab partners to counter Iran, even while diplomacy was ongoing. This organizational shift facilitated a more coordinated regional defense posture against Iran.
So fewer troops in some places initially, but potentially better coordinated responses across allies later on.
That was the aim. While trimming some deployments, the U.S. bolstered network coordination, and they still use shows of force. Remember those B-52 bomber missions over the Gulf in January 2021? They were explicitly flown to reassure allies and deter Iranian aggression during the U.S. leadership transition, suggesting a calibrated mix of diplomacy and deterrence from the outset. The 2021 recalibration seemed to be about reducing physical deployments where possible, while bolstering coordination and trying to prevent uncoordinated Israeli action.
But the posture shifted again in 2022 and 2023 towards more active deterrence, partly driven by Iran's proxies, right?
Exactly. By 2022, Iran's regional activities, particularly the Houthi missile and drone attacks on the UAE in January 2022, forced the U.S. to augment its Gulf posture again. After a deadly Houthi attack in Abu Dhabi and subsequent missile interceptions near a U.S. base there, Washington rapidly bolstered UAE defenses.
What did the U.S. send?
On February 2, 2022, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin announced the deployment of the USS Cole destroyer and advanced F-22 and F-35 fighter jets to assist the UAE against the threat. This was a tangible U.S. military response reassuring Gulf partners. This led to increased coordination. A notable initiative revealed in June 2022 was the U.S.-sponsored Middle East Air Defense Alliance, or MEAD.
An air defense alliance between Israel and Arab states.
Yes, where Israel and several Arab states began electronically linking their air defense systems to counter Iranian missile and drone threats. Israeli Defense Minister Gantz publicly mentioned this, calling it a mechanism that had already foiled attacks. This rare public acknowledgement highlighted a burgeoning intelligence and radar cooperation between former foes, sharing real-time data under U.S. leadership to create a more effective shield against Iran. It helped fill gaps from the earlier U.S. drawdown and dovetailed with that C&E-COM integration.
Can you describe that Middle East Air Defense Alliance visually? What does that look like in practice?
Imagine a vast, invisible web or dome stretching across the region. It's woven together by interconnected radar signals and high-speed data links, connecting Israeli systems, Arab partner systems, and U.S. command centers. When an Iranian missile or a Houthi drone launches, it pings on multiple radars almost instantly across this network. The shared data allows for faster tracking, identification, and crucially, a coordinated interception attempt, possibly using the best positioned interceptor from any member nation. It's a technological shield built on shared threat perception, enabled by U.S. diplomacy and C&COM integration, leveraging advanced capabilities like Israel's to protect the whole network.
That cooperative defense network is a major shift. Was this posture tested further as Iran pushed boundaries, particularly at sea?
Yes. In late 2022 and early 2023, Iran and its proxies targeted Israeli-linked maritime and energy interests, increasing the conflict's visibility. The Shahed 136 drone strike on the MV Pacific Zircon in November 2022 and another drone hitting an Israeli-linked vessel in February 2023 were seen as retaliation. The U.S. responded by intensifying its naval and air presence to deter further Iranian harassment of shipping.
Iran kept harassing ships.
Yes. By July 2023, with Iran having seized or harassed some 20 commercial ships over 2 years, the U.S. Fifth Fleet stepped up patrols. After Iranian naval units attempted to seize 2 tankers and backed off only after U.S. warship intervention on July 5, 2023, Iran still managed to brazenly seize another ship the next day, underscoring the escalating threat.
How did the U.S. respond to that continued maritime threat? What was the reason for the big U.S. military buildup in the Gulf in 2023?
In response to Iran's persistent maritime aggression and seizures, U.S. Central Command surged reinforcements. A squadron of F-35 stealth fighters, F-16s, A-10 attack jets, and additional destroyers were deployed. Then, in early August 2023, an amphibious ready group, led by the USS Bataan, carrying some 3,000 Marines and sailors, was sent to the Gulf. Marines aboard could potentially be used for boarding operations to protect threatened vessels. CNTCOM's commander, General Michael Kurilla, conducted a high-profile transit through the Strait of Hormuz on a destroyer, a very visible show of force.
So the primary goal was deterring Iran at sea and reassuring allies.
Yes, that was the immediate goal. But the sources also highlight a key, perhaps less stated secondary goal, to deter Israel from attacking Iran in a destabilizing unilateral strike. U.S. planners feared that escalating tensions, particularly at sea, could lead Israel to launch a direct attack on Iran, potentially sparking a regional war the U.S. wanted desperately to avoid.
So the U.S. presence was also aimed at restraining Israel.
To some extent.
Yeah.
By patrolling Gulf waters and containing Iran's maritime provocations, the U.S. hoped to reduce the perceived need or pretext for Israel to resort to force itself. It was a delicate balancing act.
Describe that U.S. posture. It sounds like walking a tightrope.
It really does. Imagine walking a tightrope. On one side, you're pushing back against Iranian aggression, maritime attacks, proxy threats, with patrols and reinforcements. On the other side, you're implicitly trying to keep Israel from taking actions, like a major strike, that could make the whole rope snap and plunge everyone into chaos. You need enough force to deter Iran, but not so much provocative action that it pushes Israel over the edge or Iran into a corner. It's about containing the immediate threat while managing the potentially catastrophic bigger one. This posture was further tested when the Israel-Hamas war erupted in October 2023. The U.S. rapidly deployed 2 carrier strike groups to the eastern Mediterranean, primarily to deter Iran or Hezbollah from exploiting the crisis and expanding the conflict, signaling that broad Iranian intervention would meet formidable U.S. resistance. So, summarizing the posture shifts from 2022-2024, Iran's actions intensified, leading the U.S. and partners to shift from quiet realignment towards active deterrence. This involved new coalitions like MEAD, high-profile deployments to check Iran, especially at sea, which also enabled Israeli operations through shared data and airspace access. It was calibrated to prevent all-out war, and deterring Iran was also hoped to stave off an Israeli strike. By 2023, the Gulf buildup aimed to deter Iran, reassure Gulf partners, and give Israel security while reducing its incentive for risky unilateral action, making the conflict far more visible.
Let's pause for a quick micro recap on those military posture shifts.
We discussed the shifts in U.S. military posture, from initial drawdown in 2021 to Israel joining CENTCOM, and then a buildup by 2022-2024 with more assets deployed, fighters, naval groups, and new initiatives like the Joint Israeli-Arab Air Defense Network, MEAD, all aimed at deterring Iran while also trying to manage regional stability and potentially restrain unilateral Israeli action.
Beyond the military posture, a critical dynamic was the articulation and testing of red lines, what each side declared it would not tolerate. Let's start with Israel's declared red lines.
Yes, Israeli leaders consistently articulated these red lines between 2021 and 2024, focusing primarily on Iran's nuclear program and its regional military entrenchment. On the nuclear front, the message was unwavering, preventing Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon.
How did they phrase that?
PM Naftali Bennett declared at the UN in September 2021 that Iran's advances had crossed all red lines. He stated Israel will not allow Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon, hinting at potential unilateral action and describing Iran reaching a critical point. This echoed a long-standing Israeli vow that an Iranian bomb is an existential threat. This stance continued under subsequent leaders. PM Lapid in 2022 insisted Israel keeps its freedom to act against Iran's nuclear sites. By late 2022, as Iran enriched to 60%, Israeli officials grew more explicit. Former defense officials stated Israel must be ready for a preemptive strike because Iran was closer than ever. Upon returning to office, PM Benjamin Netanyahu also reiterated that all options are on the table to prevent a nuclear Iran. The nuclear red line was effectively set at preventing a weapon, specifically focusing on high levels of enrichment, like 90%, or the actual assembly of a bomb.
So the nuclear red line was about preventing a weapon capability, not necessarily stopping all enrichment below that level.
Generally, yes. Preventing the acquisition of a nuclear weapon capability with very low tolerance for the final steps like enriching to 90% or assembling a device. Beyond the nuclear issue, Israel maintained firm regional red lines against Iran's military foothold and advanced weapon transfers to proxies, especially near its borders.
Particularly in Syria.
Yes, this was most visible in Syria, where Israel has consistently warned it will not allow Iranian forces or advanced Iranian weapons to take root near its border. We mentioned earlier those 3 no's articulated by former Defense Minister Gantz regarding Syria. Can you recall what Israel's 3 no's in Syria were?
Let me see. No Iranian weapons shipments through Syria to Hezbollah, no Iranian military bases near Israel's border, and no proxy precision missiles massing near Israeli towns.
Exactly. Those were the core red lines Israel sought to enforce through its war between wars air campaign in Syria, striking Iranian-linked targets hundreds of times. Israeli officials openly stated they would continue these strikes despite escalation risks. Another related red line was the transfer of game-changing weaponry, like precision-guided missiles or advanced air defense systems or drones, to proxies, particularly Hezbollah in Lebanon. Strikes on convoys and warehouses in Syria, like hitting missile guidance chip shipments in March 2023, were justified as enforcing this red line, no Iranian shipment will cross, to Hezbollah that significantly altered the balance of power.
And if red lines were violated?
Israel asserted the right to respond, sometimes covertly, sometimes more openly. The lethal drone attack on the Mercer Street tanker in July 2021, which killed 2 crew members, was called a red line crossed by PM Bennett, who vowed a response, describing it as a wake-up call that Iran had crossed the line. That response ended up being coordinated diplomatic pressure with the US and UK, but it reinforced the red line that lethal attacks would not go unanswered.
Israel also drew a red line around Iran's presence near its new Gulf partners.
Yes. As Israel normalized relations with Gulf states via the Abraham Accords, Israeli officials welcomed the ties but warned the new partners about potential Iranian retaliation against them for cooperating with Israel. When the Houthis attacked Abu Dhabi in 2022 while Israeli President Herzog was visiting, it underscored this risk. Israel has since increased intelligence sharing with Gulf states, effectively drawing a joint red line that Iran must not attack Gulf soil or shipping with impunity, with Israeli and U.S. assistance in countering such threats. In summary, Israel's key red lines from 2021-2024 solidified around 1. The nuclear threshold preventing weapons capability, especially 90% plus enrichment or bomb assembly. 2. Iranian military expansion preventing proximate bases in places like Syria and preventing transfer of precision arms to proxies like Hezbollah. These were communicated via speeches, policy, and military actions.
Now let's look at Iran's side. Iran also had clear red lines it warned Israel and the U.S. against crossing during this period, right?
Iranian leaders issued their own red line warnings, often framed as deterrent threats of massive retaliation. A persistent refrain was that any Israeli military attack on Iran's territory or its nuclear facilities would cross a dire red line and trigger direct Iranian strikes on Israeli cities.
What was the specific language they used? That sounds like a core Iranian red line.
Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei and other military and political officials repeatedly threatened that if Israel makes the slightest mistake against Iran, the Islamic Republic will raze Tel Aviv and Haifa to the ground. That specific phrase, raze Tel Aviv and Haifa, became a core element of Iran's strategic messaging. It signaled that an existential attack on its nuclear program or territory would trigger full-scale retaliation on Israel's heartland.
Did they back that up?
Iran backed these threats with displays of capability, including simulation videos released during military drills showing missile strikes aimed at Tel Aviv, and even explicitly targeting Israel's nuclear reactor complex at Dimona in response to a hypothetical attack on Natanz. These signals highlighted how Israel's nuclear red line intersected directly with Iran's red line regarding its nuclear sovereignty and territory, creating a dangerous potential for miscalculation.
What other red lines did Iran articulate?
Iran's leadership also established red lines regarding the safety of its personnel and the sanctity of its territory. Following Israeli covert operations inside Iran, such as the assassination of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh and the killing of IRGC Colonel Sayed Qadai in Tehran in May 2022, Iran warned Israel against further terrorist acts on Iranian soil.
How did they respond to those killings?
An Iranian government spokesman stated in June 2022 that security of Iranian citizens is Tehran's red line, vowing Iran would take any necessary measures reciprocally. After Qadai's killing, there were alleged Iranian plots against Israelis abroad, particularly in Turkey, which were foiled. These were seen as attempts to enforce this red line through asymmetric means. Similarly, when Israel struck IRGC officers in Syria, killing 2 in March 2023, the IRGC publicly vowed revenge, warning that the Zionist regime will undoubtedly receive a response. Tehran signaled that spilling Iranian blood, even outside Iran, would not be tolerated without retribution.
What about Israel's growing ties in the Gulf? Was that an Iranian red line?
Yes. Another significant Iranian red line concerned Israel's growing presence near Iran's borders and in the Persian Gulf. As Israel normalized relations with Gulf states, Iran's military leaders issued warnings to those neighbors. In June 2022, IRGC Navy Commander Adaman Fakhrizadeh cautioned Gulf countries that giving the Zionist regime a foothold in the Gulf would destabilize the region and harm their security, effectively drawing a red line against Israeli military or intelligence presence in countries like Bahrain or the UAE.
So Iran sees Israel's presence near its borders as a major threat that warrants a response. They view it as encirclement.
Yes. They view it as provocative encirclement that could trigger counteractions. This stance was reinforced by Tehran's unease over reports of Israel deploying radar systems and cooperating with the U.S. on integrated air defenses in the Gulf. In response, Iran pursued diplomatic rapprochement with Saudi Arabia and the UAE, effectively signaling that deep normalization with Israel was a red line that jeopardized détente. The Iran-Saudi breakthrough in March 2023, brokered by China, reportedly involved Riyadh agreeing to curb overt security ties with Israel, while Iran toned down proxy attacks on Saudi territory, suggesting a mutual understanding of certain red lines helps de-escalate tensions with some Gulf states, at least temporarily.
Did Iran have red lines related to the IAEA and international pressure?
Yes, Iran's rhetoric also established red lines around how its nuclear program was treated in international forums like the IAEA Iranian officials consistently bristled at IAEA investigations and what they saw as Israeli lobbying, calling certain inquiries politically motivated by Zionists. They warned that Iran's cooperation with the IAEA had limits, as demonstrated when Iran cut off monitoring cameras after a critical IAEA report in June 2022, framing it as a response to perceived Israel-driven pressure crossing an Iranian sovereign red line. Sensitivity to perceived Israeli influence often triggered hardline countermoves.
And finally, during the Gaza war in late 2023, any red lines there?
Yes. During the Israel-Hamas war in late 2023, Iran articulated a red line regarding the escalation of that conflict. Iranian officials warned that if Israel's assault in Gaza continued unabated or holy sites were threatened, other fronts would open, a clear reference to Hezbollah and other proxies potentially entering the war more fully. Iran signaled that an Israeli push to utterly destroy Hamas or forcibly expel Palestinians from Gaza could force its hand to intervene more directly via its network.
Was that red line tested?
It was arguably tested. Iran encouraged proxy harassment, like attacks on U.S. bases, and allowed Hezbollah limited strikes on northern Israel, but refrained from engaging in a full regional war. Israel, for its part, also calibrated its actions in Gaza, likely under U.S. pressure, to avoid triggering that broader conflict with Hezbollah.
That caution on both sides suggests the red lines, despite being tested, also served to moderate behavior to avoid worst-case scenarios.
They did. Israel calibrated its Gaza actions to avoid triggering a full-scale war with Hezbollah. And Iran, while activating proxies, held back its most powerful options. Both sides seemed to respect an unspoken ultimate red line, that a multi-front conventional war would be disastrous for everyone involved.
Okay, another review question. What were the types of actions Iran warned would cross its red lines? Give a couple of examples.
Key examples included a direct Israeli military attack on Iranian territory or nuclear facilities, prompting the Res Tel Aviv threat, the killing of significant Iranian personnel, especially on Iranian soil, and Israel establishing a threatening military presence right on Iran's doorstep in the Gulf.
So we have these articulated red lines from both sides. The sources highlight that during 2021-2024, these lines were constantly being tested, sometimes crossed, and potentially even misunderstood. What were the consequences of this dynamic? How did it increase visibility?
The dynamic of red lines being violated or tested, leading to retaliation or calibration, often stemmed from one side misjudging the other's limits or deliberately pushing them. This process of pushing and probing, testing the boundaries, is precisely what contributed to the invisible conflict becoming much more visible and dangerous.
Let's look at some examples of how these red lines played out in action, leading to that increased visibility. The nuclear issue seems central.
Yes. One major Israeli red line was Iran's nuclear progress toward weapon capability. This line was arguably breached incrementally without triggering an immediate, overt Israeli military strike on Iranian facilities. By 2022-23, Iran was enriching to 60% and producing traces near 84%. Israel called this unacceptable, saying, all red lines have been crossed. But Israel stopped short of an overt military attack on Iran, which would cross Iran's explicit raised Tel Aviv and Haifa red line.
So instead of overt strikes on nuclear sites, Israel used covert means.
Israel intensified its covert campaign. Sabotage operations like the April 2021 Natanz attack and assassinations of Iranian nuclear or military personnel. Iran, in turn, responded in the gray zone, accelerating enrichment further, as after Natanz, and reportedly plotting against Israelis abroad. In this dynamic, each side felt its red lines were being violated. Israel saw unchecked nuclear advancement and Iranian regional entrenchment, while Iran saw deadly covert attacks on its soil and personnel.
But neither went all the way to open war.
No. Neither escalated to full open warfare, partly due to U.S. mediation efforts and mutual fear of the other's retaliatory capabilities. This highlights the risk of misjudgment.
Misjudgment, how so?
Iran may have misjudged that 60% enrichment wouldn't trigger an Israeli military strike as long as it stayed below weapons grade. Israel perhaps misjudged that its covert operations would pressure Iran without triggering direct overt retaliation on a new front. Both were correct up to a point, but the margin for error narrowed considerably as Iran came within weeks or days of nuclear breakout capacity by early 2023.
Was there any attempt to manage this brinkmanship?
The sources mentioned that by late 2023, U.S. intelligence reportedly helped broker informal limits, with Iran slowing 60% enrichment for a time specifically to prevent crossing Israel's final red line of 90% enrichment or weaponization, indicating a tacit understanding on both sides of how dangerously close things had come to the brink.
It sounds like they were constantly probing the limits of what the other side would tolerate. Let's talk about the personnel safety red line. You mentioned the Erbil strike as an example of strategic misreading.
Exactly. That was another instance where Iran's red line about protecting its regional operatives seemed to be ignored by Israel, leading to a rare direct Iranian retaliation. In March 2022, Israel struck IRGC positions in Syria, killing 2 senior IRGC officers. The IRGC publicly vowed revenge. Less than a week later, Iran launched those ballistic missiles into Erbil, Iraq, targeting what it claimed was an Israeli Mossad base.
Remind us of the significance of that Erbil strike.
It was significant because it was a rare direct Iranian missile attack on an Israeli-linked target outside its borders, and Iran claimed it, framing it as answering Israel's Syria strike. This episode revealed a red line that perhaps Israel had previously misread or underestimated. Israel may have assumed Iran would absorb limited personnel losses in Syria, as it had done before, but killing IRGC officers in quick succession seems to have prompted Iran to directly strike back on a new front in Iraq.
Did Israel learn from that?
The Erbil attack surprised many observers and signaled that Iran's tolerance for casualties inflicted by Israel had limits. Israel did not counter-retaliate openly after Erbil. This suggests Israel might have taken a lesson, temporarily cooling its strikes in Syria to avoid another, potentially more damaging, direct Iranian missile response.
But the strikes in Syria didn't stop forever.
No. By 2023, Israeli strikes on Iranian personnel resumed in Syria, indicating that Israel's strategic imperative to enforce its Syria red lines, preventing Iranian entrenchment, ultimately outweighed the risk of another direct Iranian response like Erbil. Iran, in turn, again vowed a response, but seemed to shift back to more deniable proxy attacks like sporadic rocket fire at U.S. bases in Syria, perhaps a recalibration after Erbil, preferring not to hit Israel directly unless absolutely necessary to avoid the risk of drawing in the U.S.
And in the maritime domain, red lines are clearly crossed there.
Blatantly violated by both sides, arguably. Israel had a quiet red line against Iranian weapons smuggling by sea, leading to alleged Israeli sabotage of Iranian ships like the Civis in 2021. Iran responded by striking Israeli-linked commercial vessels, culminating in the Mercer Street attack in July 2021, which killed civilians. That action crossed an international red line regarding attacks on civilian shipping and drew global condemnation, adding another layer of visibility and international involvement to the conflict.
So what does this constant testing, crossing, and recalibrating of red lines tell us about the conflict's visibility overall?
The cycle of action: perceived red line violation, response, and counter-response, often escalating the stakes and sometimes involving misjudgments, stripped away deniability. Actions that were once strictly covert, like sabotage or assassinations, were followed by responses that were increasingly public, whether legislative changes after Fakhrizadeh, bold nuclear steps after Natanz, direct missile strikes, Erbil, or explicit proxy attacks, post-Octel in 2023. By late 2023, the invisible conflict fully showed its edges. There were open fire exchanges between Israel and proxies like Hezbollah, international shipping was threatened in plain sight in the Red Sea, and great power navies like the U.S. were actively intervening. The sides tested limits constantly, but consistently stopped short of all-out conventional war, perhaps fearing the catastrophic consequences. This period from 2020 to 2024 will likely be remembered as the time when the long-simmering Israel-Iran confrontation, previously conducted largely in the shadows, finally erupted into an undeniable, albeit low-intensity, regional conflict. One fought with precision weapons, proxies, economic pressure, and high-stakes brinkmanship, all playing out in plain view of the world.
Let's do a big mega recap for this final section on deterrence and red lines.
Section 4 covered the evolution of U.S. military posture in the Gulf, the articulation and testing of Israeli and Iranian red lines, and how the interplay of these elements, including strategic misreadings, increased the conflict's visibility.
Here's a bullet point summary for retention. U.S. posture shift. The U.S. military presence in the Gulf evolved from an initial drawdown in 2021 to a heightened deterrence posture by 2022-2024, including deploying fighter jets naval assets, for example, after Houthi attacks on UAE versus maritime threats, and promoting regional air defense cooperation, Middle East Air Defense Alliance, to counter Iran and reassure partners, partly also to deter a unilateral Israeli strike, Israel's red lines. Focused on preventing Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons capability, especially enriching to 90% or beyond, and preventing Iranian military entrenchment and the transfer of advanced weapons to proxies in neighboring countries like Syria and Lebanon. Remember the 3 no's in Syria, Iran's red lines. Focused on deterring any direct Israeli military attack on its territory or nuclear facilities, threatening massive retaliation on Israeli cities like Tel Aviv, Haifa, protecting its personnel, ensuring the sanctity of its territory, opposing Israel's growing presence near its borders Gulf, and setting limits on international oversight of its nuclear program. Testing red lines. Both sides tested each other's limits. Iran's nuclear escalation to 60%, 84% traces, tested Israel's red line without triggering overt military strikes, while Israeli covert actions, assassinations, sabotage, tested Iran's red line on personnel territories, sometimes leading to explicit retaliation like the Erbil strike, strategic misreadings, misjudgments like Israel killing IRGC officers in Syria leading to Iran's rare direct missile strike on Erbil, or Iran's maritime attacks leading to increased U.S. presence, pushed the conflict into greater visibility, though both sides often calibrated responses to avoid full war. Outcome. The period saw the shadow conflict shed much of its deniability, becoming an undeniable, albeit low-intensity, regional conflict playing out in plain view, with clear boundaries tested but generally respected enough to avoid full-scale war.
So looking back at this pivotal period from 2020 to 2024, based on the sources we've explored, what can we conclude about the state of this rivalry and what does it suggest for the future?
Right. We've reached the end of the Israel-Iran rivalry during the pivotal period from 2020 to 2024. What's the essential takeaway from all these sources and events we've covered? What's the bottom line?
The core takeaway, I think, is that this period represents a fundamental shift. The long-running clandestine conflict between Israel and Iran, the shadow war, moved dramatically into the light. It's not really in the shadows anymore, is it?
Not really. Covert actions triggered increasingly overt responses, diplomatic failures ran parallel to significant nuclear acceleration, and the dynamic of pressure and proxy blowback became much more visible and dangerous across the region.
Exactly.
What were some of the key strategic consequences that the sources highlight coming out of this period? What changed permanently, perhaps?
Well, first and foremost, the conflict's intensified visibility means its edges are now undeniable. It's no longer truly hidden. Everyone sees it now. Second, Iran's nuclear program advanced significantly, altering the strategic calculus and bringing Iran closer than ever to a nuclear weapon threshold capability. That's a major change.
The breakout time shrinking to days is huge.
Third, the sources show a dangerous spiral where diplomacy failed while nuclear advances accelerated. Fourth, pressure campaigns and proxy actions increased tensions and the constant risk of regional conflagration. Think about the Red Sea situation. And finally, the testing and occasional violation of red lines, sometimes involving misjudgment, pushed events into the open, even as both sides showed some calibration to avoid all-out war.
So where did that leave things by the end of the period covered in the sources, say end of 2024, early 2025?
As of the end of 2024, based on these sources, Iran is effectively a nuclear threshold state, possessing enough highly enriched uranium for multiple bombs. And the constraints and verification measures of the JCPOA are largely defunct, irrelevant.
Looking ahead, based on what we've learned from these sources, what are the major risks and potential pathways for the future of this rivalry? Where could this go?
The sources point to several significant risks. There's the continued risk of Iran's nuclear escalation, maybe deciding to enrich to 90% or take steps toward weaponization, which could trigger that direct military confrontation Israel keeps warning about.
The big war scenario.
Yes. There's also the high risk of a wider regional conflict ignited by escalating proxy actions, especially in flashpoints like the Israel-Lebanon border, or continued attacks on maritime roads, which threaten international navigation and stability. We saw how quickly things flared up after October 2023.
What about pathways forward? Any hope for de-escalation?
As for potential pathways, the sources suggest the international community faces a stark challenge. Either find a completely new diplomatic framework to verifiably constrain Iran's nuclear program and address its regional actions, which seems incredibly difficult now, or contend with the increasing possibility of regional escalation and manage the reality of a nuclear threshold, Iran. With Iran's nuclear advances and the heightened tensions, Israeli leaders have repeatedly hinted that time may be running out for a non-military resolution, putting the onus back on finding an effective way to address Iran's capabilities before, in their view, it's too late.
It's a really complex and high-stakes situation. Given the level of detail we've just gone through from your sources, the intricate details of remote assassinations, cyber sabotage, precision strikes, proxy attacks, explicit red line warnings, and the movements of major military assets, here's something for you, the listener, to really mull over. Is the concept of a truly invisible conflict between major state actors still possible in today's hyper-connected, intensely monitored world where information, technology, and proxies are so pervasive?
That's a fascinating question. Has transparency, whether intentional or not, killed the shadow war?
Or is the new normal in this rivalry simply a state of simmering, low-intensity conflict that everyone can now see playing out, but that nobody perhaps can fully control? Something to think about.
Definitely food for thought.
Thank you for joining us. This is a critical and complex topic, and we hope this exploration has helped you gain a clearer understanding of this pivotal period in the Israel-Iran rivalry. Keep asking questions, keep exploring.
Iran now sits at the nuclear threshold. Israel vows it will not wait for that threshold to be crossed. Both sides understand each other better and trust each other less. Every red line has been tested. Some have been ignored. And yet war has not come. Not yet. Series 2 ends in a world of strategic clarity and moral ambiguity. Deterrence has become ritual. Violence has become language. And what began as a scriptural alliance has become a regional countdown. And the clock is still ticking.
Please like and subscribe.